He kicked the harmless dog, not realizing it belonged to Ronda Rousey. What happened next changed him forever. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what city you're watching from. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides of the road, a blistered horizon of red earth and wavering heat. It was the kind of place most people passed through without stopping, a nowhere between destinations, forgotten by maps and patients alike. The pavement shimmered like glass, warped under the punishing midday sun, and the wind carried the dry rattle of distant brush like whispers from bones long buried. Overhead, the sky was a blinding dome of blue without mercy or shade. Ronda Rousey drove with one hand loosely on the steering wheel, the other resting on the door, fingers absently tapping to the rhythm of nothing. The truck was old, sun-faded blue with chips in the paint, and a few dents that told stories she never felt the need to explain. It groaned when she turned, squeaked when it hit bumps, but it ran true. It was dependable, like the woman behind the wheel, and like the dog sitting beside her. Gus, her corgi, sprawled across the worn passenger seat, belly rising and falling with slow contentment. His ears perked once in a while as they passed a billboard or the skeleton of an old gas station, but mostly he just enjoyed the wind from the open window and the smell of hot air. Ronda glanced at him, the corners of her mouth tugging up ever so slightly. There wasn't much to smile about lately, but Gus always seemed to help. He wasn't just a pet, he was a reminder that some things still made sense. People came and went, titles faded, cameras disappeared, but Gus had never cared if she won or lost. He just wanted to ride. She rubbed the back of her neck with one hand, her skin slick with sweat. The road sign ahead was so sun-bleached it was nearly unreadable, but she didn't need it. She knew this route. Not because she'd traveled it before, but because she'd lived on roads like this most of her life. The in-betweens. The pauses between applause. The silences after the bell rang. It had been months since she'd stepped away from the lights, from the interviews, from the screaming crowds. Not because she lost a fight, though she had. Not because she was tired, though she was. But because something had shifted inside her. Something quiet and hollow that no training or press tour could fill. She had told no one where she was going. She wasn't even sure herself. There was no destination, just motion. The gas gauge blinked amber. She sighed and flicked on her blinker out of habit, though no one was behind her. A lone sign read "Gas, 1 mile," with an arrow crooked enough to suggest someone had hit it years ago. She turned off the highway and followed the road, dust kicking up behind her like a ghost she wasn't ready to face. The gas station looked like it had survived the end of the world. 2 old pumps leaned under a rusted metal awning, their hoses tangled like dying snakes. A vending machine stood near the entrance, half filled with melted candy bars and sun-bleached soda bottles. The office behind the pumps was a low, squat building with a tin roof and a dusty front window painted with the word "open," a claim that seemed more hopeful than accurate. Ronda pulled in and turned off the engine. The sudden silence made her ears ring. She let it sit for a moment, both hands on the wheel, staring ahead. Gus sat up, tail thumping once, then twice, then faster. He knew this routine. She smiled again, small and worn at the edges, then opened the door. Heat poured in as she stepped out. Her boots hit the pavement with a dull thud. She stretched her shoulders, rolling them forward, then back, feeling the familiar tension that never quite left. She wore jeans and a faded tank top, her hair pulled back into a simple braid. No makeup, no earrings, no armor. Just Ronda. She walked around to the pump and began to fill the tank. Gus hopped out and immediately sought the nearest shade, which happened to be under the vending machine. He sprawled out, tongue lolling, eyes half closed in bliss. A low voice from behind the counter greeted her when she entered the station office to pay. The attendant was a young man, maybe 20, with a sunburn across his nose and arms too skinny for the heat. He barely looked up from his phone. She slid a bill across the counter. "Thanks," she said. He glanced at her, did a double take, then blinked. You're..." She held up a hand. "I was. Now I'm just driving." He nodded dumbly, and she left before the questions could come. Back outside, the air was even heavier. She took a bottle of water from the small cooler in the back of her truck, cracked it open, and took a long drink. Gus lifted his head at the sound, then flopped back down with a grunt. That was when she heard it. The distant rumble of engines. Not cars, bikes. She turned slowly, already knowing what she would see. 6 motorcycles crested the hill behind the station, sunlight glinting off chrome and paint. The sound wasn't deafening, but it was purposeful, loud in the way someone shouted not because they had to, but because they wanted to be noticed. They rode in tight formation, tires kicking dust and gravel, leather jackets marked with patches, skulls, fire, slogans too faded to read from this distance. They didn't slow until they were nearly on top of the station. Then they peeled off, one by one, forming a semicircle around the pumps. Ronda stayed where she was. Not afraid, not curious, just still. The men dismounted, 6 in total. Their movements had the easy confidence of people who didn't expect trouble, or welcomed it. One of them cracked a beer and took a swig, tossing the cap into the dust. Another lit a cigarette with sun-baked fingers and blew smoke toward the sky. She scanned them quickly. 4 of them were older, hard men with weathered skin and tired eyes. Another was tall and lean, with mirrored sunglasses and a quiet tension, but it was the youngest, maybe mid-20s, who drew her attention. He had a twitch in his shoulder, an energy too sharp for the heat. His vest was cleaner than the others, the leather still new. His boots were polished, his jeans tight. He had the look of someone trying too hard, the constant itch of someone who hadn't yet been knocked down. She didn't need to hear him speak to know he was trouble. He spotted Gus almost immediately. The corgi was lying on his side, eyes closed, tail occasionally swishing. The young biker's lips curled. "Nice dog," he muttered to no one in particular. Ronda didn't move. Gus opened one eye, then closed it again. The biker walked a little closer. "Fat little mutt, isn't he?" Ronda's eyes followed him. No expression on her face, no tension in her muscles, not yet. The biker raised his boot. "Hey, pork chop," he said with a grin. "Nap time's over." And then he kicked. Not hard, not brutally, but enough to jolt Gus from sleep with a startled yelp. The dog scrambled back, tail between his legs, eyes wide. Ronda moved then, not quickly, not dramatically. She just stood, placed her bottle on the hood of the truck, and turned. Every head turned with her. The wind died. The sun hung suspended above them all, hot and still. And Ronda Rousey began to walk. The space between footsteps can sometimes be louder than the footsteps themselves. When Ronda moved, she did not rush. She did not tense her shoulders or square her jaw. Her walk was measured, casual almost, like she was crossing a room rather than approaching a group of men who could tear apart anyone else who dared look them in the eye. But beneath that calm exterior, the air had shifted. The heat felt heavier. The wind that had danced lazily across the asphalt seemed to halt entirely, as if the desert itself were holding its breath. The young biker who had kicked Gus hadn't noticed that shift. He was still grinning, watching the small dog cower backward under the vending machine, laughing at the reaction he had provoked. He looked back at his buddies, expecting smirks and approval, eager for recognition like a schoolyard bully. The others didn't laugh, not immediately. One of the older bikers, a thick-set man with gray threaded into his beard and a scar down the bridge of his nose, gave a low grunt and shook his head. Another, quieter, crossed his arms and watched Ronda with narrowed eyes. Only the man who had kicked the dog, Vance, as she would later learn, kept his shoulders loose and his mouth curled, oblivious to what was building. Ronda's eyes didn't leave him. Each step she took was deliberate, like she was counting them in her head. Her face remained unreadable, neither angry nor cold. It was far worse than that. It was empty. Empty of reaction, empty of performance, empty of the heat he had expected to ignite. She stopped several feet away, arms at her sides, gaze steady. Gus had crept out from under the vending machine and was now sitting close to the truck, staring at her with soft, alert eyes. He wasn't shaken anymore. He was waiting. The young attendant behind the counter inside the gas station had pressed his face to the window, lips parted, eyes wide, sensing something was about to happen, but not knowing what. A couple in an old sedan, parked at the far end, stopped mid-conversation, the woman gripping the dashboard as if she, too, could feel the drop in temperature despite the baking heat. The leader of the bikers, Mace, watched Ronda with something approaching recognition. His instincts, honed over decades of riding, fighting, and surviving, whispered a warning in the back of his mind. He didn't move yet. He wanted to see how this played out. Vance finally noticed that no one else was laughing. He looked back at Ronda, squinting slightly, confusion flickering across his face. "What?" he barked, throwing his arms out in a gesture that was half defense, half challenge. "It's a damn dog. He'll live." Ronda said nothing. She didn't need to. May shifted on his feet, lighting a cigarette with the kind of slow, intentional ease of a man who'd seen too much to be surprised but wasn't ready to stop being cautious. The silence stretched thin between them. Vance, feeling the weight but not understanding its shape, pushed forward. "What's the problem, sweetheart?" he asked, voice sliding into mockery now. "You training that rat for a fight or something?" A few of the older bikers muttered under their breath, exchanging glances. They knew the look in her eyes now. They'd seen it before, in bars before chairs started flying, in alleys before knives came out. They knew when someone wasn't bluffing. But Vance didn't. He was too young, too desperate to prove something, too unfamiliar with what it meant when someone didn't blink. Ronda's gaze finally shifted, not to Vance, but to Mace. She studied him, taking in the way he stood, the way his eyes flicked between her and the others, measuring, calculating. She could see it, the awareness, the understanding that things were spiraling beyond anyone's control. Then she spoke. "You should teach your people better." Her voice wasn't raised, wasn't sharp, but it carried. The words landed like stones dropped in still water, ripples spreading outward. Mace exhaled smoke through his nose, saying nothing. Vance scoffed. "Teach me what? How not to scare a mutt?" Ronda's eyes moved back to him, slow as a gun barrel turning. The tension grew palpable, but it wasn't explosive. It was quiet, suffocating, like the moment before a storm when the air presses down on your skin. One of the older bikers stepped forward slightly, voice low. "Vance, maybe just leave it." But Vance was too far gone, too caught up in the performance. He took a step closer to Ronda, arms spread, smile crooked. "Look, lady, I don't know who you think you are, but—" "You don't," she cut in. The words stopped him cold. Her eyes locked on his, and for the first time, something inside him hesitated. "You don't know who I am," she repeated, voice even, "and you should have left it at that." Vance shifted, glancing nervously at his crew, realizing, too late, that none of them were backing him up now. Even Mace's face had hardened into something unreadable. Ronda took a slow breath, letting the moment stretch, giving him every chance to step back to make the right choice. But she knew he wouldn't. People like Vance didn't back down until someone made them. She felt it, the shift, the inevitability, but she didn't move. Not yet. Mace finally spoke, his voice gravel and sand. "Vance, walk away." Vance laughed, a short, nervous bark. "Walk away? From what? She's just some chick with a dog." Another biker muttered something under his breath. Mace's jaw tightened. Rhonda's gaze didn't waver. "You want to prove something?" she asked, voice quiet. "Prove you can walk away." But Vance had never learned how. He took one more step, closing the space between them, squaring his shoulders. "You think you're tough, lady?" he said. "You don't scare me." Rhonda smiled then, not wide, not cruel, just enough to let him know the game was over before he even realized it had started. "Good," she said, "I don't want you scared." The air around them crackled, the moment coiled tight, a wire stretched to breaking. Inside the gas station, the young attendant whispered something, voice trembling. "She's not gonna hit him," the woman in the sedan murmured to her husband. "She's gonna break him." Outside, Vance shifted his weight forward, one hand twitching as if to grab, to shove, to escalate. Rhonda didn't move. She didn't need to, because the most dangerous people aren't the ones who shout. They're the ones who wait, and Vance was about to learn why. The desert air had thickened like honey, clinging to skin and breath alike, though the sun had begun its slow, imperceptible descent toward the horizon. The shadow of the rusted awning at the gas station stretched longer now across the cracked pavement, but it did nothing to cool the heat that pressed down on everyone standing in that lot. The hum of insects filled the silence, joined only by the occasional tick of cooling engines and the faint breeze slipping across the arid plain. Yet, despite the familiar sounds of the desert, everything felt unnervingly still. Rhonda stood unmoving, her body relaxed, eyes pinned on Vance. He had stopped only a foot away from her, a boy trying to look like a man, still riding the momentum of his own bravado, even as it began to falter under the weight of everything unsaid. The other bikers behind him were silent now, no longer amused or entertained. They watched, but not like spectators waiting for a fight. They watched like men who knew a lesson was coming and were grateful it wasn't theirs. Mace, standing slightly apart, leaned back against his bike and smoked without looking at Vance. He didn't have to. He already knew what was happening. He had seen men like Vance his whole life. Young, loud, hungry for respect they hadn't earned, desperate to fill the hollow inside them with fear and noise. He had also seen what happened when they finally pushed up against something immovable. Vance's lips twisted into something resembling a smirk, but it cracked at the edges. He pointed toward Gus, who had settled again beneath the truck, calm now, only because he trusted Rhonda more than he feared the world. "All this over a dog?" Vance asked, voice louder than it needed to be. "You're making a scene over Mutt?" Rhonda didn't reply. She let the question hang there, a hook without bait, watching how he squirmed beneath the silence. Her breathing was steady. She felt no anger now, only the cold, focused awareness that years in the ring had carved into her like stone. It wasn't about the dog. It was about the choice he had made when he thought no one would stop him. And she knew how this played out. People like Vance weren't stopped by fists or screaming. They were stopped by the absence of fear. The wind shifted again, lifting dust from the edges of the lot. Somewhere beyond the hills, a hawk circled lazily in the pale sky. Vance took a half-step closer, shoulders drawn tight. "You think you're better than me?" he spat. "You think you're going to stand there and judge me over a damn dog?" The question wasn't for her. It was for himself, for his crew, for anyone who might still be watching. He needed the sound of his own voice to drown out the quiet inside him. Ronda studied him, measured every movement. She saw how his weight shifted unevenly on his feet, how his fists tightened and relaxed over and over, how his eyes darted to the others, searching for reinforcement and finding none. "You're not here to scare me," she said finally, her voice low but cutting through the air like a blade. "You're here to scare yourself a little less." Vance's jaw twitched, the words hitting somewhere he hadn't expected. He sneered, trying to shake them off to puff himself back up. "I don't need to scare anyone," he shot back. "I just do what I want." Ronda tilted her head slightly, the ghost of a smile at the corner of her mouth. "Then why do you keep looking at them to see if it's enough?" The older bikers exchanged glances again, this time with something like pity. They had all been Vance once. Some of them still were. Vance's face darkened. His fingers flexed at his sides like he wanted to throw a punch, but the space between them felt too wide now, too heavy with something he couldn't name. Mace let out a long breath and finally spoke. "Vance," he said, voice rough like gravel, "that's enough." Vance glanced back at him, his shoulders twitching in frustration, but Ronda's gaze didn't leave him. She stood rooted, calm, unflinching. "This ain't worth it," Mace added, not unkindly but without compromise. "You're about to cross a line you won't get to uncross." For a second, Vance seemed to consider it. His chest rose and fell, his lips parted, but the noise inside him, the one that told him he wasn't enough, that he had to prove something, was louder. He shook his head sharply, almost like clearing it, and took another step forward. "You don't tell me what's enough," he snapped. "Neither of you." Ronda could see it now, the breaking point. He didn't want to fight her. He wanted to fight the voice in his own head, but she wasn't going to give him that out. She spoke again, her voice like stone. "Walk away." Vance snorted, shaking his head, posture stiffening like a coil wound too tight. "I don't take orders from—" He moved then, the tension snapping, his arm reaching out to shove her back, to puncture the unbearable weight of her stillness. Ronda didn't flinch. She stepped aside, effortless, letting his momentum carry him past her, and with a simple, practiced movement, she caught his wrist, turned, and redirected. Vance found himself spun off balance, stumbling forward, arms flailing to keep upright. Before he could recover, her foot swept behind his ankle, and he hit the ground hard, a cloud of dust puffing up around him. The bikers didn't react. Mace watched quietly, cigarette burning between his fingers. Vance scrambled to his feet, face flushed, hands clenched into fists. "You want to go?" he barked, voice cracking on the edges. Ronda didn't move. "You think this is a fight?" she asked, almost gently. He lunged again, and this time she sidestepped, let him swing wild, let him overreach. She didn't hit back. She didn't need to. His anger was a rope he'd tied around his own neck. When he missed again, stumbling forward, she caught him by the back of the vest and halted him mid-motion. For a moment, she held him there, breathing steady, her grip like iron. "This isn't about me," she said quietly enough that only he could hear. This is about you not knowing when to stop." She released him and he spun to face her, breathing hard, but there was something different in his eyes now. Not rage, not pride, confusion, and fear. Mace tossed his cigarette to the pavement, grinding it out under his boot. He spoke without looking at either of them. "You done, Vance?" Vance's shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly, but he nodded once, jerky and stiff. Ronda turned without another word and walked back toward her truck. Gus sat up, wagging his tail once, sensing something had shifted. Behind her, the bikers murmured quietly among themselves. Mace approached Vance, resting a heavy hand on his shoulder, leaning in to speak low and measured. The attendant inside the gas station finally exhaled, wiping a hand over his face like he'd been holding his breath the entire time. The tension in the air slowly began to unravel, but it wasn't gone. It lingered in the cracks, in the dust, in the echo of things left unsaid. Ronda opened her truck door and glanced once more over her shoulder. Vance stood apart from the others, not looking at her, his shoulders hunched inward. She didn't smile. There was nothing to smile about yet. The desert wind picked up again, sweeping the silence into motion, carrying it beyond the gas station, beyond the cracked pavement, out into the empty miles ahead. The confrontation was over, but the real reckoning hadn't even begun. The sound of boots scraping against the coarse pavement broke the silence, a subtle reminder that the tension hadn't fully drained from the air. The bikers still lingered like heavy clouds on the edge of a coming storm, their posture no longer arrogant, but uncertain. Vance stood apart from the rest, his chest still heaving from the quick, fruitless bursts of motion that had left him winded and humiliated, though not yet broken. His face, flushed with the heat of failure, told its own story, one of a man who had finally glimpsed the borders of his own bluff. Ronda hadn't returned to the truck just yet. She stood by the open driver's door, resting one arm on its frame, her back partially turned to the group. It wasn't dismissal. It wasn't disinterest. It was something more dangerous, deliberate exposure. She showed them she had nothing to fear, not even from behind. That kind of gesture didn't come from arrogance. It came from mastery. The silence clung for a few long moments more, filled with the scratch of wind and the dry creak of the station's old sign swaying gently overhead. Finally, Mace stepped forward. He didn't rush. He walked like a man with weight in his bones, like every step had to mean something, and this one did. He approached slowly, not to challenge but to clarify, the way a captain would walk toward an approaching storm, not sure whether it would pass or break over him. "You fight like a pro," he said, voice steady but low. "Or maybe not fight. Handle. That's the better word for it." Ronda turned her head just slightly, enough to glance at him, but she didn't answer. Mace tilted his head toward Vance without looking. "He's an idiot sometimes, that ain't new. But you're different. I seen men twice your size get flattened and not stand up that steady after." Ronda looked back toward Gus, who had now settled completely under the truck, panting softly, tail occasionally flicking the dust. She knelt for a second, checked his pause, ran her hand along his side, then stood again. "I've had practice," she said simply. "Yeah," Mace muttered, almost to himself. "I can tell." The other bikers were inching toward their bikes now, not eager to mount up and leave, but unsure whether staying longer might tempt fate again. Vance, to his credit, hadn't moved. He stood rooted to the same patch of pavement, fists no longer clenched but hanging at his sides like anchors that no longer served a purpose. Mace gave Ronda a thoughtful look. "You could have put him down hard," he said. "A lot of folks would have." She raised an eyebrow. "That's not strength," she replied. That's theater. He smiled faintly, something like respect flickering in his weathered eyes. Could have fooled him. I wasn't trying to. Her gaze shifted again toward Vance. The young man wasn't looking at her now. His head was turned slightly, eyes focused somewhere far off across the road. Rhonda took a slow breath and walked back toward him, not aggressively, not with menace, but with purpose. The others stilled, sensing something more intimate about this second approach. It wasn't the prelude to a fight anymore. It was the aftermath. When she stopped in front of him, Vance didn't look up. His jaw was set, but not in defiance. It was the tightness of someone holding something back. "Look at me," she said quietly. It wasn't a command, it was a call. He did, slowly. His eyes were bloodshot, not from tears, but from strain, effort, emotion, confusion. "You're not a threat," she said. "You're not even angry. You're scared." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The words never formed. She didn't wait. Scared of not being enough. Scared that one day someone's going to see through all that noise and realize you don't know who you are without it. He blinked. A flicker of something sharp passed across his face, but it wasn't rage. "You don't earn respect by kicking someone weaker than you," she said. "You don't gain strength by pretending you're fearless. You gain it by knowing when you've gone too far and stepping back before someone else has to make that decision for you." Behind her, no one moved. Even the wind had hushed again. "I've broken people in cages," she continued. "I've heard bones snap under my hands. I've tasted blood that wasn't mine. And none of it ever made me feel stronger than stopping myself before I could go too far." Vance swallowed hard. His throat bobbed. "You don't want to be feared," she said. "That's easy. Fear is cheap. You want to be trusted. That takes more than guts. That takes character." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence in his posture said enough. Rhonda stepped back, her job done. She turned to leave, but Mace's voice stopped her again. "You served?" She looked over her shoulder. "No, just fought." "Feels like you served," he said. "Not in uniform, maybe, but in the world. Some kind of war, anyway." "We're all in something," she said. "Some of us just admit it sooner." Mace nodded, the line hitting close enough to make him look away. "You're right about fear," he said after a long pause. "I used to think I needed to scare everyone into following me. Got the scars to show for it. But fear fades. Respect, that stays." He looked at his crew. "They saw today. They'll remember it." Rhonda offered a half smile. "Let's hope they remember the right part." He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Yeah," he said, "that the lady with the little dog had more control than any of us ever did." She walked back to the truck, not slowly, not with finality, but with the kind of grace that was its own punctuation mark. She opened the driver's door, reached in to offer Gus a sip of water, then climbed in. Mace watched her go, as did the others. No one said anything as she started the engine. No engines revved. No laughter rose. They just stood and watched her pull out of the lot, turn back onto the highway, and vanish slowly into the shimmering stretch of asphalt that led to everywhere and nowhere. Only after her dust trail had faded into the heat did Mace speak again. "She didn't flinch," he said. "Nope," came a reply from one of the older men. "Didn't strike unless she had to." "Nope." Mace took off his sunglasses, rubbed his eyes, and looked at Vance. "You good?" Vance didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice was quieter than they'd ever heard it. "I thought I was." The wind picked up again, like the land itself had been waiting to exhale. Far ahead on the road, Ronda drove in silence. The landscape rolled by, the horizon a blur of heat and memory. Gus had settled again on the seat beside her, his small body pressed against hers, seeking reassurance. She reached over and scratched behind his ears without taking her eyes off the road. She hadn't needed to hurt anyone. She hadn't needed to scream. She had needed only to be herself. That was the lesson. And somewhere behind her, a boy who had thought himself a man was beginning to understand that too. The road unraveled ahead of her like a ribbon left out in the sun, cracked and curling at the edges. Ronda drove without hurry, her hands loose on the wheel, the windows rolled halfway down to let in the cooling air of the late afternoon. The heavy press of the midday heat had started to lift, the shadows growing longer, stretching across the desert as the sun dipped lower towards the jagged line of mountains in the distance. The air smelled of dust and sage, and something faintly sweet carried on the wind. Gus dozed beside her, his head resting on the seat, ears flicking every so often at the sound of tires on asphalt or the rattle of the occasional tumbleweed skittering past. Ronda's gaze remained steady on the road, but her mind was still back at the gas station, replaying the scene not as a victory, but as a wait. It wasn't over. Not really. It never was when the lesson hadn't sunk all the way in. The empty miles passed beneath the tires until, in the rearview mirror, she noticed the growing dots of headlights far behind her. For a long while, she kept her speed, letting the space remain. But as the lights drew closer, as the unmistakable rumble of bikes reached her ears once more, she eased off the gas and let them catch up. By the time she pulled off onto a gravel turnout overlooking a wide stretch of desert, the sun had slipped lower, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and red. The heat lingered, but it had lost its bite. The quiet felt heavier now, waiting for something. The sound of engines died behind her as the bikers pulled in one by one, dust kicking up around them. They parked without words, dismounting like men who knew something important hadn't been finished back there. Mace was the last to kill his engine. He swung a leg off his bike, took a long moment to stretch his back, and then walked slowly toward her. Vance trailed behind, his steps uneven, his face unreadable in the fading light. Ronda remained by her truck, leaning against the door, arms crossed loosely. She didn't speak, just watched them approach. It was Mace who broke the silence. "We ain't following you," he said quietly. "Not in the way you think." Ronda arched a brow but said nothing. He glanced over his shoulder at Vance, then back at her. "Figured maybe we left something unsaid." She gave a short nod and motioned toward a fallen log a few feet away, half buried in the sand. They walked over without ceremony, sitting down, the dry earth crunching beneath their boots. The others lingered by the bikes, not intruding, but not leaving either. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind moved over them, carrying the faint scent of creosote and old earth. Gus had jumped down and trotted over to sniff the log before settling by Ronda's feet, letting out a soft, contented huff. Mace finally cleared his throat. "You knew who we were back there," he said, "or what we were." Ronda's gaze flicked to him, then back out toward the horizon. "Didn't need to," she replied. "You told me with how you stood." He nodded slowly, understanding. Vance remained quiet, sitting a few paces away, hunched forward, arms resting on his knees, staring at the ground like it might offer him answers. Mace took a long breath, exhaling through his nose. "You said something back there," he continued, "about fear, about trust, about character." She glanced at him again, waiting. "I used to think," he said slowly, "that control meant people flinching when you walked in, that it meant knowing you could break someone in half if they crossed you. He scratched the back of his neck, the leather of his cut creaking softly. "But watching you back there," he shook his head. "You didn't need to raise a hand to control a damn thing." She let the words hang there, letting him find the rest of them himself. Mace leaned forward, resting his elbows on his thighs. "Got me thinking," he murmured. "Maybe I've been doing it wrong." They sat in silence after that, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable but heavy with meaning. After a while, Ronda spoke, her voice low. "It's easier to scare people," she said. "Easier to make noise, to push, to bark, to break." She glanced toward Vance without turning her head. "Harder to sit still. Harder to admit when you're the one who's scared." Vance flinched at that, almost imperceptibly. "You're not the first kid who thought he had to kick something smaller to feel big," she continued, her voice soft but steady. "But the world doesn't get better when we're the ones making it worse." Vance lifted his gaze slowly, meeting hers for the first time that evening. "I thought I had to," he said quietly. "I thought if I kept being loud, if I kept pushing, maybe no one'd see how small I felt." Mace glanced at him, something unreadable in his expression. "I know that feeling," Ronda said. "You spend your whole life thinking if you can just be tougher, louder, stronger, it'll drown out everything else. The noise in your head, the people who made you feel like nothing." Her gaze softened, but her voice didn't lose its edge. "It never works." Vance swallowed hard, looking down at his hands. "I don't know how to be anything else." Ronda shook her head. "You do," she said. "You just haven't tried." Another stretch of silence passed, filled only by the whispering wind and the distant hum of a coyote call. Mace shifted beside her, clearing his throat again. "We weren't heading anywhere in particular," he said. "Didn't have a place to be tonight." Ronda looked at him, one brow raised. He gave a half smile, faint and worn. "You mind if we share this view a while?" She nodded once, and they sat there together, the sun bleeding away behind the hills, the sky folding into deeper shades of indigo. As darkness crept across the desert, one of the older bikers ambled over, wordlessly handing out bottles of water from a saddlebag. No one spoke when he did it, but the gesture was understood. They sat like that until the first stars prickled into view, the earth cooling beneath them. Eventually, Mace stood, stretching with a groan. "Well," he said quietly, "we'll let you be." He glanced back at Vance. "You coming, kid?" Vance hesitated, then looked at Ronda. "Thank you," he said, voice hoarse. She nodded, offering nothing more, because she knew it wasn't about her. As the bikes rumbled back to life and peeled away into the night, the echo of their engines slowly fading into the distance, Ronda remained on the log a while longer, her gaze lifted to the stars. Gus shifted beside her, resting his head against her leg. She let out a slow breath, the weight of the day still heavy on her shoulders, but somehow easier to carry now. Because sometimes strength wasn't in the fight. Sometimes it was in knowing when to stop fighting. The desert at night was a different creature entirely. By day, it roared and shimmered, a relentless expanse of heat and dust that threatened to swallow anyone foolish enough to underestimate it. But under the stars, it breathed quietly, as if the earth itself had exhaled after holding its breath all day. The sky stretched infinitely above, heavy with constellations sharp enough to cut, the horizon a soft blur against the velvet dark. Ronda sat behind the wheel, engine humming quietly as the road stretched out in front of her like a ribbon of possibility. The reflection of the stars danced faintly on the windshield, and beside her, Gus had curled himself into a compact ball, snoring softly, as if the world's troubles had finally passed him by. The night air was cooler now, brushing gently against her skin through the half-open window. She could still taste the weight of the conversation from earlier, the rawness in Vance's voice, the quiet crack in Mace's composure, the unspoken acknowledgement that something had shifted between them all. The echoes of that exchange lingered in the cab, like a song left playing on low volume long after the lyrics had stopped. She could have kept driving, could have let the desert swallow the night, leaving behind that broken gas station and the men who had almost let their darkness swallow them too. But some part of her, the part that had learned over years and bruises that healing wasn't a straight line, knew it wasn't finished yet. So when she saw the flickering lights of the same station coming back into view on the horizon, she didn't pass it by. She slowed, the tires crunching softly on the shoulder, and turned in without hesitation. The station looked smaller at night, half drowned in shadows, the weak glow of the overhead sign barely piercing the dark. The pumps stood like tired sentries, and behind the dusty glass of the office, the faint movement of someone inside suggested the place hadn't yet closed for the night. Ronda killed the engine and sat there for a moment, breathing in the stillness. Gus shifted awake beside her, yawning audibly before giving her a look, half curious, half expectant. She smiled faintly and reached over to scratch behind his ears. "Almost done, buddy," she murmured. When she stepped out of the truck, the cool night air settled around her shoulders like a worn blanket. She could hear the faint hum of insects, the distant howl of a coyote somewhere out past the hills. The world felt hushed, waiting. The bell above the office door jingled faintly as she stepped inside. The young attendant from earlier, his name tag, now that she took the time to read it, read Eddie, looked up sharply, recognition flaring in his eyes. "Oh," he said, blinking. "You're back." She nodded once, moving toward the counter without hurry. Eddie glanced past her shoulder as if expecting the bikers to be right behind her. "They're gone," she said quietly, reading his mind. He let out a breath and nodded, tension slipping from his shoulders. There was a long pause between them, neither quite knowing what to say. It wasn't the kind of silence that needed to be filled. It was the kind that allowed for things unspoken to settle gently into place. Finally, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. She placed it carefully on the counter. "For him," she said, "the young one." Eddie hesitated, glancing down at it. "He'll be back," she added, voice softer now. "Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but he'll come through again. You can give it to him when he does." The attendant nodded slowly, accepting the paper without reading it, sensing it wasn't meant for him. She turned to leave, but Eddie's voice stopped her. "Hey," he said, "you didn't have to do what you did back there." Ronda looked back at him, one eyebrow lifting slightly. "You could have walked away," he continued, shifting awkwardly behind the counter. "Most people would have." She studied him a moment, then shook her head. Most people don't realize how much damage you can stop just by standing still. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something more, but thought better of it. She gave him a final nod and stepped back out into the night. The door swung shut behind her, the bell jangling once more, and the sound seemed to ripple outward into the stillness, settling like dust. Gus sat patiently by the truck, tail thumping lazily against the tire when he saw her. She knelt beside him, rubbing his ears. "That's it," she said softly. "That's all we can do." She stood and climbed back into the driver's seat, the truck groaning faintly as she closed the door. She paused, her hands resting lightly on the wheel, staring out at the road ahead. But she didn't start the engine right away. Instead, she reached over to the glove compartment, pulled it open, and retrieved an old, worn photograph tucked carefully inside. The edges were frayed, the image faded, but the faces were clear. A younger version of herself, bruised but smiling, standing beside a man with the same jawline, the same stubborn fire in his eyes. Her father. She stared at it for a long moment, her thumb brushing over the paper. The road she had walked tonight wasn't new. It wasn't even unique. It was the same road she'd been trying to walk for years. One that began long before she'd ever stepped into a cage or stood beneath stadium lights. It was the road of learning to carry her strength without letting it crush her. The road of knowing when to stand and when to bend. The road of knowing how to let go. She folded the photo carefully and placed it back inside the glove box. When she finally started the engine, the sound wasn't loud. It was steady, purposeful. The headlights cut a path through the darkness, stretching far into the distance. Gus shifted beside her, curling back into himself, and she reached over to rest her hand on his head. The road was long. It always had been. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, it felt like it was leading somewhere. She drove in silence, letting the rhythm of the wheels on the asphalt settle into something steady, something calm. The stars burned bright above her, scattered across the sky like promises. And behind her, back at that old, tired gas station, a young man would one day return and unfold a piece of paper with a few simple words written in steady, deliberate handwriting. You get to decide who you become. The road never ends. You just keep choosing the right direction. And somewhere out there, beneath the vast, endless sky, that would be enough. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. Check out the other videos we've made and share this one with someone who needs to hear it.